Now, I'd like to submit that the choice is from a person's will, because Jesse actually affirms this too. We were talking about this in an email dialogue, and he said, quote, "The intention makes the action," unquote. But a choice is, of course, an action because it stems from a person's will. A will actually determines what the choice is, or determines what we will choose. There's an actual subject or a person with a character and a nature, granted, but the person, there's a subject that actually chooses, and what basis do they choose? How do they choose to have a good will or a bad will? Well, it's the will that makes the choice. So how is it that we are supposed to make the tree good and make our behavior good also as a result? Because the choice is actually a behavior that stems from the will. So how is it if Jesse says it's our choice to have a good tree or a bad tree, so we are accountable for the fruit? Now, if he means by tree, he means that it's our choice to have a good will or a bad will. He's saying that our choice that determines what that will is independent from will, because the choice would then proceed the will. Now, if Jesse denies this and he says that the choice precedes the will, then what he's saying is that our choices that we make are not from our will. And that is, we're making will-less choices, or choices not from free will. That is, the will that we choose that affects and determines our behavior is actually from a choice that we make, but without the free will to make it. So what he's arguing for is for a sort of nature that precedes your free will. And so, therefore, there's this irresolvable paradox that Jesse has. Even though his notions of free will satisfy our intuition, they do not satisfy logic or our intellect when we actually look at how he deals with these passages. Either he's right and Jesus is wrong about this, or his interpretation is just faulty and Jesus is correct. So let's look here, because he says, before the action is the intention, just like before the fruit is the tree. Jesse told me that in an email, and that would mean that that's wrong, because if he says before the action is the intention, then where is the action that causes the intention? Where does the intention come from? Just like before the fruit is the tree. If he means that before the action is the will, then how is the action to choose before the intention? That is, you're choosing whether to have a good will or an evil will before you have the intention or will to choose it. So how is choice made on that basis? It must be from a person's character, which is not just from environmental influences, but it's also by their nature, and not just biological nature, but their whole essence, the whole thing that makes a person a subject, the whole thing that makes a person what they are. Now, if choice is from our will, if choice stems from our will, and our choices are calculated by the will, so our will to choose to do either good or evil, then Jesse has committed a huge and obvious fallacy. If he says it's our choice to have a good tree or a bad tree, then we are accountable for the fruit. So if the choice to have a good will is from a will-less choice, then how can we choose either good or evil to begin with if our choices are determined by our will? Now, Jesse has the alternative to deal with this situation in two ways, which even lead to even tighter paradox that is hard to evade. You could say that my first postulate was that choice is an action that stems from a will. And if you say that choice is not an action, and choice isn't even a verb, and it's not actual, because the choice is the actuation of the will, that's how I've defined it. If you say that choice either is not an action, or you could also say that choice and will are the same thing, then you have two hard to deal with problems here. If choice is not actual, then we don't actually choose anything. We don't actually choose good or evil, and thus it doesn't help Jesse's case out at all. It actually denies his argument. Now, if choice and will are the same thing, that means that choice equals will. And that means to will your will to be good or evil, that means you're willing to will without any choice contrary to what you actually will. What determines what your will is? Your free will. Because if free will is defined by the ability and capacity to choose either good or the contrary, evil, then you're willing to either do one thing or the other, and it's completely arbitrary. You're willing to will, which would not give any kind of definite, concrete choice. It would be completely arbitrary. It wouldn't have an actual subject that determines what to choose. You're just willing to will ad infinitum. You would actually never choose anything because you haven't determined anything. You wouldn't make the choice between the good or the evil. You're just willing good and willing evil simultaneously, and you never actually determine or actuate what your will actually is. And so then we have two alternatives that you would have to deal with. Either wills are never chosen, or that wills never choose.
Sola Scriptura. There is a bay, but the shelter, there's a place for gold. Where they find it, I'm taken out of the earth, and brass is more than out of stone. Touchdown,